So first of all, I will point out some of the materials that were sent to you guys by email. There's a little, should be something that looks like a picture frame. I'll refer to that a few slides in, and I just wanted to point out that is an activity that if we were in person, as you were walking into the room, I would be giving you some markers and I would be giving you some directions about drawing what you envision your later years to be, and we encourage people to draw rather than write words, but we'll talk a little bit about how we do that, how I use that material. But since we're in virtual, we'll just kind of move along with that. And we can talk a little bit about that. And along with Elena saying, if you want to add things in the chat, she's going to be monitoring the chat, so you can do it privately to her. If you feel comfortable with everybody seeing the chat, that's fine too. But with a small group, I'm also would really like it to be as interactive and discussion oriented as possible rather than me lecturing the whole time. So I may not see you because I've only got one little screen. So speak up, or maybe raise your hand, and Elena could maybe be monitoring that as well, and we can try to bring that into the conversation. I want to first of all introduce myself. I work for the Center for Dairy Profitability. My main work has been, I've been working there for 16 years. My main work with the center is farm succession planning, but with a lot of what's been going on the past few years, a lot of my work has also been in that farm stress area. So I find that those two things actually kind of dovetail with each other, because even in really positive financial situations where the farm's in a really positive financial setting, farm transfer or farm succession can be really stressful because of the emotional pieces of that. So I'm working in both of those areas now. Before that, I was in Richland County as the dairy and livestock agent for 11 years, so I've been in extension for about 27 years. So I just want to say, and shifting gears, we have this as a retirement planning program, but this particular presentation is going to be a little bit more on shifting gears to guard your equity. So maybe not specifically the retirement planning piece. Since 2014, the ag industry, and in particular the dairy industry, has experienced low prices and tight margins. The volatility of the markets have made planning for growth more difficult, and the instability of the markets have further been complicated by tariff conflicts for the past few years. And then in 2020, we have COVID, and that disrupted the food supply chains for a lot of our markets. And then it also seemed, but with the instability due to COVID, it seems to even out a little bit financially for a lot of the farms because of the CARES Act funding with the government payments that have been provided. But that may be a one-year blip that we see from that trend of downward profits. We just don't know yet exactly what that's going to look like. I just want to point out that with the CARES Act money, and they call it CFAP and CFAP2 especially, the current projections of farm income, because of those payments in 2020, just under 44% of net farm income is going to be from direct payments. If you look at nationally, the farm income for all the farms in the nation, about 44% of that is going to be from government payments. So that's double of what direct payments represent during an average year. So while these subsidies are welcomed and necessary, it may not be enough to replenish equity that's been pulled from the farm over the past several years. So just want to point out that those of you who are working with farms this year in particular, they may be what we might consider okay, but a lot of that may be from government payments. So if the prospect of future profits for your particular farm's not high, or maybe it won't be high for a while, then the questions that we have is, how much equity are you willing to spend, and do you have enough time to build that back if you are pulling equity out of your farm? So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with this term equity. And so equity is basically what you own. So it's your total assets. So it's the land, the livestock, the buildings, the equipment, but you have to subtract out any liabilities that you have. So anything that you owe, so your mortgage, any money that you owe on machinery or livestock, or if you owe the feed mill, those sorts of things, you have to subtract that. So that total assets minus total liabilities equals that owner equity piece. So when you think about where you are financially, or farms are, if you're working with farms financially, the questions that we have to bring up if they're struggling is how much equity are you willing to spend to sort of ride out maybe a downturn, and then do you have enough time to build it back? The other question that you might be able to ask people is if they have a successor generation that they might want to farm in the future, can they take over the debt plus pay the owner generation what they need to retire? So a lot of times we'll see that, and I think Frank might be able to, would probably agree with me, is it's that question of, is that farm have those buckets, all those buckets that, can it fill those buckets? Can it be the retirement income? Can it be the income for that successor generation? And then sometimes we are also asking it to be the inheritance for off-farm children. A lot of buckets to fill for some of those assets. And when you look at equity in itself, with that liability, those debts, it makes it even harder to fill those buckets. The decision or series of decisions to shift gears to guard your equity are without a doubt some of the more difficult decisions an owner will ever make. But before making these difficult decisions, a financial analysis is in order to dig deeper into the trends of your unique farm situation. But even before that, the financial analysis, it can but even before that, the financial analysis, it can help for owners to step back and think about the bigger picture of what you want to be doing in the next 5 years. So I have this as a slide, and as I said, if we were in person, you would have already sort of drawn all over inside your picture frame to figure out, what I usually say is try not to put any parameters on your vision, so no financial, geographic, or other types of obligations. Like if you could do anything in the world, what would your retirement or your future years look like? So I don't know, with the looking at the time, I think maybe I'll skip this. What my had envisioned for you was that you would sort of annotate, or we'd have a little bit of a conversation about what your future might look like. But I think I'll skip that particular activity because of the time frame that we have. What I will point out is when I have used this in in-person workshops, it's been really interesting to see what people draw, and especially in those retirement workshops, people will draw airplanes, or maybe a camper, a little trailer, a camper trailer kind of thing, a cabin in the woods that's set above the original farmstead. So lots of different things that people might draw into their retirement plans. Some interesting things, two things I'll point out is a lot of times I really do ask spouses to draw their pictures separately and then share them. And it's kind of interesting the number of times that spouses have forgotten to draw each other into their plans. I think they assume that that's there, but really being intentional about that, and how are you going to share time together and then have time separately as well. The other thing that I will point out is that I've done this where I have different generations. I have college age kids and their parents in a workshop, and it's pretty amazing. The college age students tend to be able to draw a lot more than their middle-aged parents, and I don't know if that's because life hasn't beaten them down yet, or if it's something like they just have more ideas of what they want to do. So I just want to point out some of the ways that that's been used. But if you do think about planning what you want to do in the future or in your shifting years, this may be a great guide for you to think about the decisions that you want to make as you gather more financial information and analysis on your farm business. So this table is actually from the Farm Financial Scorecard that we have a Farm Financial Standards group that puts together some of the financial information that you can use to compare, like kind of know where you need to be. I don't think I'll run through all of the different pieces. Just know that if this is something that you or farms that you work with may want to go through, we do have resources to kind of help you think through some of the different financial benchmarks or ratios that you should be considering if you want to analyze, should you be guarding your equity. So we'd be looking at some of these particular ratios to start considering that. But one of the things would be, how do your numbers compare to industry standards? We do have some, if you look at the slide, we have the area like if, for example, in asset turnover ratio, if your numbers are below 30%, then you're in a vulnerable area. In between 30 and 45 is that watch area. If it's over 45%, that's a strong position. So just understanding as you look through these different ratios and percentages, how that reads on the financial scorecard. Again, something that we can help with if you want. But when you think about, how do your numbers compare to industry standards, but also how would these metrics look in the future if prices, and I always talk a lot of times dairy prices, what if the dairy prices are better than $18 a hundredweight? That might look very differently for where you are position wise than if it were less than $15 a hundredweight for a prolonged period of time. Again, if it's when you think about your cost of production, and it probably needs to be closer to that $18 a hundredweight or more versus below $15. And how long can you sustain $15 hundredweights and maybe be digging into your equity? But even before you take a deep dive and start making these calculations into these ratios or measurements, there are a few questions whose answers can hint to financial challenges. I think, Elena, I don't know if we need to do the poll with the number of people who are not farmers here. So I'm going to just share the worksheet. So this is a worksheet that was sent out. Can you guys see that Word document instead of the slide? Okay, great, thanks. So this is the worksheet that these are some of the questions that you might ask yourself if you are if you are farming or if you're working with farmers. These might be some of the questions that you can ask them and see if it's hinting to a little bit of some financial challenges. So is the debt for the purpose of covering previous losses or past due accounts, accounts payable increasing? Have you restructured debt but still have challenges making those payments? Are you worried about limited cash reserves in the event of a major breakdown? Do you have the resiliency to be able to cover those unexpected costs? Are credit card and charge account balances increasing? Is asset maintenance and replacement being deferred? So are you not maybe making those repairs or replacing assets that are wearing out that you would normally do? Are production practices being sacrificed to save costs and pay bills that are due? And is the amount of equity in land, buildings, cattle, and machinery decreasing? So it's not unusual to answer yes to some of these questions periodically, but the question is that the more yeses you have to these 7, and then thinking about over time, how long would you need to be answering yes to this, may be an indication or a signal that you might need to be thinking about guarding your equity. So then when you think about those questions, the other questions that you would have is thinking about that infrastructure analysis. Um, That is, what is the status of your buildings, your milking system or machinery or their technology? These need to be maintained and eventually modernized or replaced so that they don't become unusable, obsolete, or less efficient. The older the infrastructure and technology, the higher the likelihood of increased cost of production. This can be a slippery slope that eventually eats away at profit margins and equity. Sometimes what I've heard this called is thinking about like, you're not making those replacements on your machinery or your buildings. Because you might have heard the phrase that you're living off depreciation because you're not replenishing those depreciated assets the way that you would normally. So, is the operation able to keep up with the maintenance of capital assets, or is it falling behind and creating a time when a major cash infusions is going to be needed? And then even under the, is there, are you going to need to modernize? And especially if you're considering a next generation, you may need to consider if you're able to do that to make it a kind of operation that that next generation is going to be able to take on and not only have the debt of maybe purchasing the operation from you, but also having to look at borrowing a lot of money to make that modernization that they may see as important. So, these are expensive a lot of times, these sorts of maintenance and modernization. So you really need to decide, is it the time for you to do that? Or is that something that you may not see your ability to build that equity back up if you try to infuse that in there? So your age may be a factor on how you decide, do your plans allow you to reap those long-term benefits of that improvement? Again, if that next generation is going to be there and help with that and help with those, recoup those costs, then maybe that's something to consider. But you have to make sure that the farm is big enough to do what it needs to do. And then the next question is that management. Are you prepared to continue the challenges and addressing those challenges of your current situation, or could you be more effective and successful with transitioning to something different? Are you ready to, again, age plays a role in this. Younger managers are maybe looking at their opportunity to be in and grow an operation, and they may be willing to take more risks. When you think about that, as you age, a lot of times it's just normal that you're not going to take as much risks with the assets that you have. And a younger generation, because they have more time to build it back, they're more willing to make those risks. So as an older manager, you have to decide, are you willing to take the risks that improving or changing or new enterprises might need to be brought onto the farm? Are you willing to think about the management that might be, the learning curve that might be there to take on those? Do you have the tools and the know-how and willingness to change? Um, and then do you have the energy and enthusiasm and passion for the industry that you're in now, or even a different enterprise? If motivation is low and it's hard to continuously to make good decisions for the long term, you have to have that motivation to do that. So those are just three quick areas, those 7 questions about financially, where are you? Then the infrastructure analysis, and then your management. Are you ready, and are you motivated to make the changes that might need to be made for you to improve your financial position? So thinking about that, if you've decided that looking at those 3 areas and then maybe doing some of that more in-depth analysis that we talked about a few slides earlier, if you've decided that the best course of action for you and your family is to guard your equity and consider shifting gears, then what do you do, right? First of all, you need to think about, congratulations on making a tough decision to guard your equity. Now, what are some of the potential first steps? I see we've got a couple of chats, so I'm just going to look. Right. And, thinking about maybe the next generation can just diversify in a new enterprise to learn management experience. That's definitely, we see that happen quite a bit. So when we look at what are those next steps that you can have is the way Kevin Bernhardt, who I've relied a lot on some of his work for this presentation, he always talks about tomorrow morning after breakfast. What are the next things that you can do? Once you've made this decision, what are some next steps? One of the first things is making sure that you're communicating this decision to the key people that need to know it, right? If you've been thinking about this as an individual and you have a spouse or other partners that you haven't quite had this conversation with, make sure that you start having a conversation so that your partners and family understand the thought and analysis you've done to come to this conclusion, and that and the reasons why you feel that preserving equity is the best decision for the family and the farm at this time. Um, then thinking about developing your team, assembling your team, that would include your spouse, business partners, parents, siblings, lenders, suppliers, consultants, accountants, attorneys, your children, making sure that, and maybe not all of those people, right? You need people on your team that you trust and you feel like can help you support and help you through some of these other analysis and decision making that you're going to have to make. It gives especially when you think about involving family members, it also gives them the opportunity to grow their understanding of the need for change and support the ultimate decision. And again, that might be the time, when you're thinking about guarding equity, the phrasing that I like to use is you're maybe guarding equity for yourself if you need that in retirement, but you also may be guarding equity so that you've got some of the land base or some of the resources so that when that next generation is ready to step in, they have something to start with. So thinking about if there's a new enterprise, they still have some equity that you can maybe help contribute to that next generation starting that next business or that new enterprise. When you think about brainstorming options, some of the ones that we think about immediately, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the things that we know that get considered when you think about that partial liquidation, it reduces the debt burden. Maybe it can help reduce that debt burden you have, maybe provide some working capital, but preserves a family legacy or a potential seed for that next generation to use a foundation. So I want to make sure that I do not lose the fact that you have to be very careful about what assets you decide to liquidate. You want to make sure that you're working with your accountant or your tax specialist as closely as you possibly can to make sure that you're making the decisions in the right sequence and at the right time so that you can limit your tax burden when you sell certain assets. That's like a whole nother webinar that we could do when you talk about thinking about what assets to sell. Something that might be considered is partnerships or cooperation with other farms. Thinking about, if you've got two farms that are fairly close and maybe in a similar situation, but one of the farms has a facility that's modernized, and maybe that's where the animals can be, and you can milk the cows at that facility. You can, and maybe the other farm has a better handle on managing crops. That's a very simplified sort of description or an example of partnerships or cooperation that can happen, but it is something to think about that you could start investigating. The other thing that you could do is, and I see this a lot of times with an owner generation that maybe just physically do not want to do the farming as they have in the past, is that maybe they can lease the assets, especially the land and maybe the buildings, depending on the status of those the repair, where they are in repair for those buildings. But you could rent out or lease assets to another operation. And if it's a younger beginning farmer, that can be some real sense of accomplishment of helping someone else get started. And then finally is, if you feel like the complete exit is what needs to be done, again, working with your tax specialist to make sure that that is done in a way that manages taxes and gains the greatest value for the assets and preserves the most equity, and maybe preserves, being able to stay in your home, if that's something that's a real goal. So again, just making sure that you consult with them, with those tax specialists and an attorney, to make sure that you're doing everything you possibly can to preserve as much equity as possible. Okay, I'm going to stop right there and see if we have any questions or discussion, because I feel like I've been talking for a really long time. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to share? Any questions they'd like to ask? Frank, you're muted if you're...
People like to have me on mute. One of the things you pointed out, I think so important, that's equity. The equity in a farm, I see a number of farms, they have all kinds of equity, but not earning equity. Typically, land returns about 5 or 4%, or 4 or 5%. So it's an asset that doesn't generate a lot of income. So the farmer and the family, and they look at it and say, we're worth $2 million, $1.5 million of it's equity in the land. And then you say, how can you get some of that equity out of the land? And in many cases, something has to be sold to make liquid money.
Yeah,
So thank
that's
you
a
for
really,
pointing that
yeah.
out.
That's a really good point. I've worked with farms where they have a lot of land, but a lot of it's wooded, right? So it's not, um, maybe not as productive for their enterprise. So you have to consider, yeah, they look like on paper they have a lot of equity, but how is that generating the income for them? And then, and if they're looking at exiting the business and they say they have $1.5 million in assets, how do they get that $1.5 million? And especially if they want their kids to own the land, does that mean that they have to charge their kids full market value for that land? Or, the other thing is they borrow money against their assets to improve the business, right? They have to figure out how to use those assets. So yeah, that's a really good point. Are those assets turning over and giving you the income? So the things that I want to move forward with, after you've had those conversations and you think about some of your options, the things that I really want to point out is, do you know, or do the farms that you work with know their family living or household costs? I think that this is one of the things that people are a little surprised when they start really looking at their household costs, their family living costs, how high they are, because they usually say, oh, well, we don't spend a lot on things. So I just want to point out, in some of the next slides, we'll talk about what are the average household costs for a certain age group of farmers. And then the other thing is you have highly marketable skills and a work ethic that is very valued in the industry, different industries. And I think maybe Sue is going to be working on the next month's presentation, may be something that you're going to cover on some of those things. So I won't talk too much about that. And then depending on where you are, you need to consider your Social Security benefits. And the only thing that I'm going to say about that is, if you're close to an age that you can start getting benefits, working with someone to find out what's your best option. Do you take them early at 62? Do you wait until your full retirement age? Or do you wait even longer until you're 70, where you can max those out? Would be the things to consider there. So those are the three things that I want to point out. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into the family living things piece now. So I just want to point out, So there's this database, and it's from the Center for Farm Financial Management at the University of Minnesota, and it's called FinBin, and they gather a lot of financial data about farm financial data. And one of the things that they gather, along with, a lot of those ratios that we talked about earlier in the presentation, is household expenses. And so I want to see, this is something I want you guys to say. If you look at this is an age group of 51 to 60-year-olds. The report that I ran was all types of farms, so crops, dairy, beef, hogs, all kinds of farms. The average farm size is 2.6 family members, and we had almost 800 farms in this data set. So when you look over 2016 to 2019, what do you think the average annual expenses, family living expenses, would be for this data set? Let me just put something out there.
C.
Christy, was that you?
Yep.
And which one did you say?
C.
C. Okay. You got any others?
We have a C, we have a B in the chat.
Okay. Christy, you're right. So just to clarify what these expenses, these are regular household expenses, right? Like food, utilities. Then they tried to suss out the utilities that would go to the household rather than all, sometimes utilities get kind of lumped together with the farm, but they tried to pull that out. And it would be vehicle expenses that can be attributed to the family. I will point out that this number includes the cost of income taxes, savings, investments, and maybe other non-farm related expenses, like if they have a cabin that they're buying someplace up north or something like that. So if you take out that other non-farm expenditures for thinking about income taxes and off-farm purchases of land and things like that, and it's just basically, what does it take for them to live, and this includes health insurance and out-of-pocket medical expenses. Those are in the just what it takes to live. If you take out the income taxes and some of those other non-farm expenditures, that number drops down to about 64,000 for this age group. So but then I wanted to point out, like, okay, what's the next thing I wanted to look at? We're going to go with the same size or same age, but we're only going to do dairy farms. The average farm size is a little bit bigger, 3.1. A smaller data set. We only had 75 farms that but I wanted it for all of those 4 years of 2016 to 2019. So again, the average annual expenses, this one does include, off-farm expenditures. What do you think the number is for this group? Oh, do we have some answers in the chat?
We've got a B, we've got a D.
Okay. Yeah, it's the lowest one of the group. Yep. And if you take out, again, all of those other non-farm expenditures, then it drops down to $50,000. So it's not as big of a drop for that all farms. The all farms was at that 89, and then if you take out some of those other expenses, it would be it was closer to 64. So it's not as big of a drop, but it's lower. We'll talk a little bit about this as well. We'll do another one. We got 2 more here. So this one is the same age group. I decided to do crop and beef farms. So it means that they have beef, but they also sell some crops. And I decided to do that instead of just beef because I figured in general that maybe crop and beef farms might be a more common thing rather than just doing just beef. So so maybe I'm wrong about that, but average farm size is 2.4 members. The data set is 72 farms. And again, for those 4 years, what's the average annual expenses? What do you think this one is? going to become a process of elimination here because the numbers are all the choices are all the same. Yep, I think you guys got that one right. All right. Last one is same age group, just crop farming. Family size is 2.6. And this one is a larger data set. This data set is mostly from Midwest farms, a lot from Minnesota, South Dakota, Iowa, those sorts of things. So process of elimination, does anybody want to shout out what this answer is? Yep, we got D. That's it. So for this one, again, if we take out, I want to point out that with this group, if you take out those non-farm expenditures that I listed, which is like income taxes, off-farm, maybe land investments that are off-farm, anything that is sort of non-farm related expenses, and it's not in those family pieces, family living expenses. So it goes from 101,000 and it drops down to 69,000 of those for those family living. This particular group of crop, the non-farm expenditures, they paid almost $21,000 in income taxes. So I find that it's interesting that, you know, our big years for crop years were much earlier in the, you know, 2010, like 2012, I remember being a fairly good year, I think. Frank might be able to correct me on that, but this is an average for all of these years. So it's interesting that crop is so much higher. I do want to point out though, that these are the expenses for these households within these age groups and enterprises. It does not mean that those enterprises that they are running are actually covering these expenses. There's significant off-farm income for many of these farms and families, which is a different data set that we could look at to see, like, if you look at different age groups and different enterprises, how much off-farm income is actually probably helping cover a lot of these expenses. It's interesting that there's usually less off-farm income for dairy enterprises. And I think because it's more labor intensive, and when you look at younger than this age group, younger dairy farm families tend to have larger families, so they're maybe not having the capacity to do a lot of off-farm jobs or off-farm work. But because dairy farms tend to have a lot less off-farm income, I think that's also indicating that their family living expenses are tightened down a lot more than a lot of other people. I think we really have to consider that off-farm income and what it is doing for a lot of farms. The other thing that I want to point out is that for this age group, especially this data set, the cost of health insurance, when I took the cost of premiums and out-of-pocket expenses and put that against the family living expenses, right? That's the ones that are a little bit lower, not this high number, because I didn't put it against the income taxes and their off-farm expenses that they have. Their healthcare costs are between 19 and 23% of their household expenses. So that's a bigger chunk of cost when you look at percentage wise than when you compare it to other just in general households in the United States, a lot of times because there's employer provided health care. For farm families, a lot of times they may be paying for it themselves, but again, these people are working off farm too, so we don't know for sure if their employer is providing health care or not. So is there any discussion or questions about this? I think always find that people get a little shocked by the numbers, especially farm families that I'm working with. I've had farm families where they're like, oh, 25,000, 30,000 is what we end up spending. And then I actually sit down with them with a worksheet and go through their checkbook. And one particular family, it was double what they thought they were. When they told me their number, when we went through, it was double their family living expenses. So I just really want to point out that this is one place that maybe you guys as people who work with farm families might be able to help them think through what really their expenses are. Any comments, questions? Okay. So I just want to, in the materials that Elena sent out to you, this particular worksheet is an attachment. This is something from our Cultivating Your Farm's Future, which is a farm succession workbook. This worksheet really helps kind of think about what are the expenses, and if there's a way that that you can put your family living versus the farm expenses. A lot of times if you think about taxes, insurance, and utilities, sometimes are kind of covered all together because the farm, and then also, if the mortgage is, your house is a part of the farm mortgage, you might want to consider what percentages of those are family living costs versus farm costs. And then also thinking through, do you have credit card debt that you need to be factoring in there as well? So that worksheet is something that you can use with farm families and hopefully would be helpful to you. And then I did mention, don't forget your skills and your work ethic. There are some resources on our Resilient Farms Families. There's an article on our Resilient Farms Families Business and Communities website, which I'll share that web address here in a little bit. There's an article that talks about, that gives some things that are, what are your skills and what are your values. The other thing that I'll point out, that if there are farmers that I know that have never had to put together a resume, never had to write a cover letter, and if that's something that they find they're with the wanting to guard their equity, they're in a position that they may need to do. I would encourage them to reach out to the farm center, because I think that the farm center, I know, looking at Morgan being on the they are working on updating the job hunting workbook for farmers. I think that'll have a lot of good information for them and help them think about their skills and then what do they want to do. And then that program also is going to be developing a program for vouchers for people to work with job coaches, so that the vouchers will pay the job coaches to help them write resumes and cover letters. And maybe at the end here, we'll have Morgan talk a little bit about that if we have time. This is our Resilience Farms Families Business and Communities website and web address. We have a lot of information on there. It's set up in some different categories, and I would encourage people to go and kind of take a look at some of the materials and the resources that we have there. And talking specifically about healthcare, I know that that is a huge expense for so many farm families, especially if there isn't anyone working off the farm. I would encourage you to go to this website. It's a part of the University of Wisconsin and some other organizations working together, which is why it's a .org website. And it has really good information on connecting Wisconsin residents. It's not just for farmers, but all residents on insurance coverage. It talks about how to deal with the marketplace and all of those sorts of things. So I would really offer this up as something to share with people if they're struggling with covering their health insurance costs. And finally, the last bit, a couple of slides that we have is, this is a new program from the Department of Ag, Trade and Consumer Protection that provides some mental health support for farmers. So the toll-free number is around the clock support. There's telecounseling that's available, and then those counseling vouchers. If you're not familiar with the counseling vouchers, those are farm families can call into the farm center and access some counseling vouchers, and then work with counselors who accept those for individual and family counseling. They have to be farmers, but this is a really great program. And then the Farm Center in general has a lot of resources and a lot of staff that can help with that. And those are in your slides, your slide set that you have. So I'm just going to open up for questions or comments or conversation. Stop sharing. My information's on there too.
Perfect. Amanda, you think I should just close it down for questions?
Stop recording, you mean?
Yeah, that's fine. Otherwise, if you want to record the questions, people might still find value in that and hearing the questions and answers.
Anybody have any questions, comments? Maybe we don't have to worry about recording them because nobody's going to have any.
Everyone got it. Was a very rich session. Joy.
It was
That was really good.
Thank you.
Great resources too that you've shared. So one thing that has been a struggle a little bit is having the conversations with others in your family. So, you know, we're already preparing our kids, we're thinking ahead. You know, this is what our plans are, and they don't care about it right now, but not everybody's like that. And so how to be able to ask the questions of your parents and have those conversations in a helpful way.
Yeah.
Without offending anyone.
Right. Don't do it at Thanksgiving, right? That's we talk about location. We talk about location and time, and how do you ask those questions to make it not look like, you know, you're asking for yourself. It's out of coming from a place of care for wanting them to be able to do what they want to do. You know, that is such a it's so dependent on the family dynamics and how families have communicated in the past. What I actually have a whole presentation on how do you start that conversation. So if that's something that people are interested in, we can think about that as a topic for a next, you know, not a next one, but sometime in the future. But I think a couple of things that I'll point out. I would say that let's say if it's an adult child, right, trying to broach this subject with their parents, I would do it maybe not like say right across from each other, right? Not have a conversation that feels like it's super important. We have to get this talked about, right? If there's the possibility of being out and doing something that you enjoy together on the farm and trying to ask that question as you're working side by side versus there's some research of like side by side versus face to face is less threatening, right? So if you think about trying to, I think about when I was more in my job role as working with farmers, if I could stand at a fence with them to the side and we're both kind of looking out at the animals, that's when you can ask those questions and be able to get some conversation going. So thinking about a time that everybody's comfortable and relaxed or doing something they enjoy versus in a real formal sort of awkward sort of time or setting. I would not do it around family gathering or events because there's already maybe a heightened level of emotion, which could be positive or negative. So I just would really encourage not having really, really in-depth conversations at Thanksgiving or things like that. The other thing is we have some brochures that we can send out, and what I've suggested to people is one of the things that and the reason I say this, I'm going to tell a story and it'll come back. So bear with me. We did this workshop called Returning to the Farm, and it was for juniors and seniors at UW River Falls, and the only way that the juniors and seniors could come to the workshop is if they got someone from the parent generation to come with them, because we wanted it to be multi-generational workshop. And one of the fathers came up to me after the 4-day session. We did 2 weekends, one weekend in January and one in February. A dad came up to me and he had the brochure that we used to advertise this program. And he said, I didn't know my son even wanted to come back to the farm until he brought this home and said, let's go to this. So if there's some sort of workshop brochure or some sort of bit of information, something that they could read in the newspaper and say, I was reading this article and it made me think of these questions, like saying, trying to bring it up in that sort of way can sometimes be helpful. So we have brochures that I actually designed after I heard that person say that to me, so that it could be sort of a prop of these are some people that could help us talk through this conversation if we need to. So those are the two things. And I know Frank has been doing this a lot of years. I don't know if he has any suggestions on how do we get families to start having the conversation that they need to be having.
I think you hit on the key one. Sometimes I've said to people, tell them you were at a program today and the speaker talked about starting this process. Have you ever thought, do you think we ought to start? Or just like you said, some way of leading in,
Mm-hmm.
call that power talking rather than your direct question. You proceeded with something else that makes the direct question not so black and white.
Yeah. We have especially for succession planning. Now, again, the presentation that we focused on today was maybe not necessarily direct succession planning, but thinking about, do we need to shift gears because financially, but we do have a workbook for succession planning and we've been sending that out, and that can be a great starting point of, let's look at some of these worksheets that we have and work on them as a family. That can be something that we can offer up for succession planning piece. It gets a little harder when you have to ask these kinds of questions to your parents because you feel like they're maybe struggling financially. That just puts another level of tension on it. If it's succession planning because we want to see this farm continue, that can be a real positive spin, right? Because you want to, maybe you're the one that wants to come back to the farm and you want to see this farm be a next generation, and that could be a really like super motivational thing you could say to your parents, and because they'd be like, oh, I didn't even know you wanted to come back, of course we'll work on this. But if it's this situation where financially they might be struggling, maybe they need to be thinking about guarding their equity, that's a little tougher. But again, I sat in on a workshop, or maybe when this gets put up on the Farmer Angels Network Facebook page, you can share that video or send them to the YouTube link and say, I think this might be a helpful thing for you to see and maybe talk through.
I love the idea about standing at the fence.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
Any other questions or comments? Well, my contact information is at the end of the slide sets that you got emailed. So you have a handout with all of the slides and my contact information. And if there are questions about farm succession planning or any of those other things, granted, we aren't able to meet in person, but if we can, I've done a lot of phone calls and Zoom meetings with farm families, so we are more than happy to help with it in that sort of way too. Oh, yes, Alina, please put the poll up. So this is our, oh, I forgot, yeah. We need their demographic data for our reporting, and then we have an evaluation poll of the presentation too. appreciate you guys sticking with us and sitting in on this presentation. Do we have the, Elena, do we have the other poll? Oh, there we go. Sorry. So this is our evaluation poll. So if you guys wouldn't mind, I think there are 3 questions, if you wouldn't mind filling those out. And granted, these were written as if you were all farmers, so we have to think about them a little bit differently. Okay. Is there anything else, Selena, that we need to cover?
No, Joy, I think that was, oh, let me share screen one more time.
Okay.
So people can see about, oh, I got too many screens. There we go. So our next session for next month is I Am the Farm with Sue Sharp. The link to register will be right here. And if Amanda, you can help drop that into the chat, I'd appreciate it. And please keep an eye out for our continuing 2021 education series. We will be covering something once a month all the way till March. So with that, that's all I've got, unless Dorothy would like to add anything else.
No, sorry, I kind of had to step in the last part of the presentation today. Really glad that everybody could join us. I think once we get this posted too, if you're welcome to kind of share that on Facebook. I think we'd certainly like to, again, give people every opportunity to take in these programs, even if they can't be here today in the afternoon.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thank you.
Very nice.
Bye.